For this next lesson, we're going to be building out banners that have the hooked edge. And there's a couple different ways that you can approach this, so I am going to be explaining this using two different methods. We'll start off by doing the bottom one first. This is just going to use some of our pseudo elements, and let's go ahead and get into it. In regards to my HTML, my page is pretty basic. I simply have an H1, I have a div with a class of box, it contains a little bit of content, and then I have two paragraphs at the bottom, and they each have a unique class. The first one has a class of special, and the second one has a class of special too. My starting CSS includes some variables for colors. I have a universal selector. I have a couple of rules on my body, some rules for my H1, and on the box, I'm simply setting the background color, an overall width, a border, a margin, and some padding. What we're going to do is we're going to start off by targeting special 2. And in order to make this happen, we're going to have to use position. So on the box element, I am going to go ahead and add a position of relative, which of course by itself is not going to do anything, but we do need this in order for the example to work correctly. Then I'm going to go ahead and make a rule for my special and special 2. We'll just go ahead and make some rules for our font color, the font weight, font style, and some padding. I'm not going to assign a background color because each of my banners is going to have its own unique background color, so we will apply those to each one on its own. We'll go ahead and we'll start off by targeting our special 2, and here I'll set my background color. For this, I'm going to be using a shade of blue, and in order to make this work, we're going to have to set the position to absolute. If we go ahead and save and refresh, you will see that this is just going to show up with the blue background, and of course our text is white. We don't see the first item because the text is also white and we have not yet assigned a background color. I will show you that in just a couple minutes. Let's go ahead and continue on to make the folded banner. In order to do this, I'm going to want to position this element. So I'm going to use a position of bottom, and we'll just go ahead and specify 20 pixels from the bottom. I'm also going to set the left value to 0. And in addition to that, I'm going to want to set some margin. We'll start off by setting margin all the way around of 0. We will be augmenting this, and then I'm going to add padding of 0 to the top and the bottom and 20 pixels to the right and the left. And as you can see, this is just going to change the width of this element slightly, and it's also stretching it all the way to the left edge. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to use our pseudo element of before to start off with. And I'm going to specify that I want my content to just be equal to nothing. So I'm just going to leave empty quote values. We're going to tab this display as a block level element. And this is also going to be using position of absolute. The left value for this is going to be 0. And the bottom value is going to be negative 14 pixels. You may need to adjust the value to get this to sit where you want it to sit, and you can always play around with that depending on what you're doing. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to specify some border settings. We're going to go ahead and create a triangular type of shape using border. So I'm going to use border right of 20 pixels. We'll make this solid, and I'll go ahead and set my color value. Then I'll set the border on the top. We're going to make this 15 pixels. We're going to make it solid, and I am going to use an RGBA value, and we're just going to pass in 0, 0, 0 for everything. So this is actually going to be invisible. Then we're going to do a border on the bottom, and we'll also make this 15 pixels solid. And we're going to use RGBA again, and we'll pass in 0, 0, 0, 0, just like we did before. If we save now and we refresh, you can see that what I end up with is a triangular type of shape. So the border on the top and on the bottom is allowing us to create this triangle type of shape. So the border on the right is a solid, but then because we're using a different value and we're passing in RGBA values of 0, we get a triangle. So this is exactly what we want. Now what we need to do is we need to adjust the Z index because we want this to actually go behind our banner. So I'm going to go ahead and add a Z index, and we'll set this to -1. If we save now, you can see that my triangle disappears, and that's because it's going behind everything, including the box element. And if you recall, if we look at the box also has position relative, so it is going behind the box, but this isn't really a concern to us because what we're going to actually do is we're going to offset the banner slightly by adding a negative margin. So remember, we passed in margin value of 0 for everything. We're going to change this to 0 for the top, 0 for the right, 0 for the bottom, and we're going to use -20 pixels for the left. That actually pulls the banner out, and now that it's away from the box element, we can see the triangle. So if I just temporarily turn off my Z index for a second, you'll see that the triangle is sitting right here. But when we have a Z index of -0, then the banner element can sit in front of it. And that allows this to kind of create this shadow type of effect. And it looks like it's wrapping around the box. So this is an easy way to create something like this. We could also make this stretch across the entire width of the element. In order to do that, we're going to have to adjust the width of special 2. So I'm going to go ahead and set a width value, and I needed to make this 105% to go ahead and take into consideration the -20 pixels that we used for the margin. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do something very similar to what we have here. I'll just copy this rule, but I'm going to create the triangle on the opposite side. So we'll use our pseudo class of after. Again, I'm going to set the content to nothing, block for display, position absolute. We're going to change left to right, and we're going to set the right value to 0. Our bottom can still be -14. Again, the Z index is going to need to be -1. Instead of border right, I'm going to change this to border left. We'll use the exact same values, and then border top and bottom can remain as is. If we save now, you'll see that the banner is going to stretch across the entire width of the box, and we get those little angled shadows on the right and the left. It looks like it's wrapping around. So this can create a nice effect if you're looking for something like this. This is what I would call more of the easy banner, and it does work fine, but you do recall when this wasn't spanning the entire width, the left edge was straight. It was just a straight value. So the next example that I'm going to show you is utilizing a different method. So the code is going to be completely different for this, but we will be able to create more of a forked edge for our banner, so it looks a little bit more like a cut ribbon. So what I'm going to do is we'll go ahead and target special. We're going to set our background color. I'm using 5C0B45, which is kind of like a burgundy type of shade. Then I'm going to add some variables inside the special element. And actually, let's make these at the top just so they're easier to find. I'm going to call the first variable F for the fold. I'm going to set this to 20 pixels. Then I'm going to make a variable, and we'll call this BE for banner edge. I'm going to set this to 10 pixels. Then I'll make one more variable called TO for top offset. Then we'll go ahead and we'll add some additional code. I'm going to need to use a position of absolute. The position of absolute is going to set the special element so that it can be positioned in conjunction to its relative closest positioned ancestor, which in this case is the box. The next property that we're going to use here is going to be the inset property. The inset property is the shorthand method of applying values for top, right, bottom, and left all at once. So we can use this for positioning elements. Instead of having to define all of those uniquely, we can go ahead and use this to create all of those values, but apply them in a shorthand way. The inset property normally takes 4 values. You could actually just put 1 value and it works the same as margin or padding, where you would be assigning values to all 4 of the position properties at once. If you set 2 values, the first value would set the top and the bottom. The second value is going to set the left and the right. And then if you do 3 values, it's going to set the top, the right, and the left, and then the bottom values. And then of course 4 is going to do top, right, bottom, and left. So it really works the same way as padding and margin when we're using shorthand. Instead of passing in values here, we're going to use our variables. So I'm going to go ahead and set the first variable to be my TO, which is my top offset. Then we're going to pair this with a calc function. So I'm going to say calc, and I'm going to go ahead and use -1, and I'm going to multiply this by our variable for the folded part. So that's going to be our F variable. And then for the next 2 values, I'm just going to set them to auto. So this second value is what's going to cause the element to be positioned to the right side of the box. And if we wanted to move it to the left, we would have to replace this value with a positive number, or we would have to adjust the last value, which is going to be the value on the left. The next value that we're going to be using is going to be padding, and this is going to set the padding of this special element. For the first value, which is top, we're going to set this to 0. For the second value, I'm going to go ahead and use 10 pixels. For my third value, I'm going to use my variable for the folded part. So we'll go ahead and pass in our variable of F. And then finally, for my last value, which is the left value, I'm going to use my calc function, and we're going to go ahead and pass in parentheses that we want to use 10 pixels, and we want to add that to the variable of BE, which is our banner edge. The next property that we're going to be using is going to be clip path. The clip path is a CSS property that's used to clip or mask an element to a specific shape. So it allows us to define a path or a shape using SVG syntax or the polygon function. When we apply the clip path to any element, any part of the element that's outside of the defined shape is going to be hidden or clipped, and it's only going to leave a portion of the element visible. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to use this polygon function. You can think of this as a way that we could plot out points so that we could draw the area of where we could have certain parts of our element show or certain parts of our element be hidden. So we're just going to go ahead and plot out several points. I'm going to pass in 0, 0. The next is going to be 100% and 0. So these are just the points that we're basically generating. The next is going to be 100%. And then we're going to use our calc function. And in parentheses, I'm going to pass in 100% minus our variable for the banner edge. Then we're going to go ahead and use calc again. And inside of our parentheses, we're going to use 100% minus the variable for the folded part. And we'll use 100% for the second value. I'm going to go ahead and use calc again. And we'll pass in 100% minus var. And once again, we're going to use our F variable. For the second value, I'm going to use calc, 100% minus var, and we'll pass in the folded part again. Then I'm going to use 0, and we'll use calc for the second value. Again, I'm passing in 100% minus the folded variable. And finally, we're going to use our variable for the banner edge. That's going to be the first value, and then the second value is going to be calc. And this time we're going to pass in 50%, and we're going to subtract the value of our folded edge variable, and that's going to be divided by 2. And then finally, what we're going to do is just add a box shadow. And for our box shadow, this is going to set the background color of our banner element. We'll use 0 for the first value. We're going to use calc for the second value. I'm going to use -1 times our variable for the folded edge. And then we're going to use 0 for the blur amount. We're going to set this to inset. And we're going to use an RGB value of black, and we're going to set it to 50%. If we save now and we refresh, you're going to see that it does create the banner, but it is not in the correct location. So let's just take a quick look at the code so that we can adjust the position of this element. And actually, I think this variable, it needs to be the folded edge. Yeah, that was actually incorrect now that I look at that. And the reason that this isn't being positioned correctly is my inset value on my calc function. I'm missing my closing parenthesis around the calc right here. So we need to get rid of that. And then this parenthesis was in the wrong place. So let's just make that quick change. We'll refresh, and now you can see this is positioned correctly. So this allows us to make this little forked edge on the left, which looks more like a cut ribbon rather than just having a straight edge. So clearly it's a little bit more complex, but what we're doing here, if we look back at our code, is this inset property is determining the position within the container. So remember, this is just the same as us saying top, right, bottom, and left, and setting all those values. We're just doing it shorthand. We're setting the padding. The first value is 0, and the second value is 10 pixels. That's going to be on the right. The third value is our folded variable, which in this case is 20. And then the fourth value, we're using a calc function to set the padding on the left to the sum of 10 pixels plus the value of our banner edge. And then the clipping path, as I was explaining before, is a way that we could just clip the visible portion of the element. So if I actually open my inspector, and if we go ahead and just check this out and we turn off the clipping path, this is what this looks like by default. So we've set the background color on the element. This box shadow is setting the bottom portion of this to be a different color. Our clipping path is actually setting 8 points. Our first point is right here. This is going to be our second point. This down here is our third point, fourth point. This would be the fifth point right here. This is our sixth point, seventh, and then the eighth. So when we add this, you can see how it clips, and we only see this little right edge of this particular element. Needless to say, these are using a couple of new CSS properties, inset, the clipping path. We are taking advantage of some of the features that we've used, variables, using the calc function, and then in the very first example, we used our pseudo element to be able to create the little triangular types of edges. I hope you found this helpful, and maybe you can find a unique and interesting way to take advantage of this in some of your projects.